if your soil feels hard as concrete, if water runs across the surface instead of soaking in, if your vegetables struggle year after year no matter how much fertilizer you buy, then the problem may not be what you're adding to the soil. The problem may be what the soil has lost. Most gardeners assume poor plant growth means the soil needs more nutrients, so they buy fertilizer. And when that doesn't work, they buy more. Yet somehow, the results stay the same. The plants struggle, the harvests disappoint, and every growing season feels like starting over again. What many people don't realize is that healthy soil isn't just dirt. It's a living community. And one of the easiest ways to tell whether that community is healthy is by looking for earthworms. Healthy soil attracts worms. Dead soil doesn't. That's why experienced gardeners pay attention to them. They understand that worms aren't really the goal. They're a sign that the soil underneath is alive, active, and working the way nature intended. So if you want more worms, healthier plants, and richer soil, the first step isn't feeding your plants. It's creating a place where soil life can survive. That's method 1. Build habitat. One of the biggest mistakes gardeners make is leaving their soil exposed. Bare ground sits under the hot sun all day. Heavy rain strikes the surface directly. Moisture disappears faster than it should. Organic matter breaks down too quickly. And the environment becomes less welcoming to the very organisms that healthy soil depends on. Then people wonder why worms never seem to stick around. The answer is actually pretty simple. Why would worms move into a place that offers no protection? Think about it from their perspective. Worms need moisture, they need food, and most importantly, they need a stable environment where they can survive. Without those conditions, they'll move deeper into the ground or leave altogether. That's why the first step in attracting worms isn't buying another product. It's protecting the soil. Many gardeners start by laying plain cardboard directly on the ground. Not because cardboard is magical, and not because it instantly transforms poor soil into rich soil. The cardboard isn't the secret. The environment it creates is. It helps suppress weeds, holds moisture longer, and gradually becomes part of the organic layer developing underneath. Then comes the protective layer on top. Mulch, shredded leaves, wood chips, straw, or any material that helps shield the soil from direct exposure. The specific material matters less than the purpose. Protect the soil, hold moisture, create a place where life can return. And when that happens, small changes begin appearing surprisingly quickly. The soil stays cooler, moisture lasts longer, and organic matter begins accumulating instead of disappearing. Then something else starts happening. The ground becomes more attractive to worms. At first, you might only notice one or two, then a few more. And one day, you pull back the mulch and realize the soil underneath doesn't look the way it used to. It looks darker, softer, more alive. That's usually the first real breakthrough. Not because your garden suddenly becomes perfect, but because, for the first time, the soil is moving in the right direction. And that's when many gardeners realize something important. The problem was never a lack of fertilizer. The problem was a lack of habitat. But creating habitat is only the first step. A house can be perfectly built and still sit empty. And that's exactly what happens in many gardens. The soil is protected. The moisture is there. The environment is improving. Yet worm activity still seems lower than expected. That's because sometimes soil doesn't just need shelter. Sometimes it needs a wake-up call. That's because sometimes soil doesn't just need shelter. Sometimes it needs a wake-up call. One of the most frustrating things gardeners experience is doing everything right and still feeling like progress is happening too slowly. You've covered the soil. You've added mulch. You've stopped leaving the ground exposed. Weeks go by, maybe even a month or two. The soil looks better. It feels better. But when you pull back that layer of mulch, worm activity still seems lower than you expected. This is the point where many gardeners start looking for stronger solutions. More fertilizer, more products, more things to buy. But the problem often isn't a lack of nutrients. It's a lack of activity. Think about a compost pile for a moment. A pile of leaves doesn't become rich compost simply because time passes. The transformation happens because countless forms of life are constantly working behind the scenes, breaking materials down and turning them into something useful. Without that activity, everything slows down. The same thing can happen in your garden. You may have already created the perfect habitat, but if soil life is still sluggish, recovery takes much longer. That's where method 2 comes in. Wake up life. One technique many gardeners use is fermented rice water. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about something. This isn't magic. It isn't a miracle cure, and it certainly won't turn poor soil into black gold overnight. What it can do is help encourage the biological activity that healthy soil depends on. When rice is rinsed, small amounts of starch and naturally occurring compounds remain in the water. After a short fermentation period, that liquid can help stimulate microbial activity when properly diluted and applied to the soil. Think of it like jump-starting a battery. A jump start doesn't create a new engine. It doesn't replace broken parts. And it doesn't guarantee perfection. It simply helps an existing system start working again. That's the role fermented rice water can play. Not replacing nature, helping wake it up. And when that happens, the signs usually appear in ways gardeners can actually see. The soil develops a richer smell. Organic matter begins disappearing faster because something is finally breaking it down. The ground beneath the mulch feels softer and easier to work. Then one day, you pull back that protective layer and notice something encouraging. Small worm castings, teeny tunnels, clear signs that life is moving through the soil again. And that's when many gardeners experience a shift in the way they think about gardening. For years, they focused on feeding plants. Then they realize something surprising. The healthiest gardens aren't built by feeding plants first. They're built by feeding the life that feeds the plants. Once that idea clicks, everything starts making more sense. Healthy soil isn't built from the top down. It's built from the ground up. And worms are part of that process. The more biological activity your soil supports, the more attractive it becomes to worms. And the more worms you have, the faster organic matter gets recycled back into the soil. Little by little, the system begins helping itself. But there's still one piece missing, because attracting worms is important, and getting them active is important. But neither of those things matter very much if they don't stay. Sooner or later, every worm, every microbe, and every form of soil life needs the same thing: food. And that's where the third and most important step of the entire system begins. Because attracting worms is one thing, getting them active is another. But if you want lasting results, you need to give them a reason to stay. Think about what we've done so far. First, we created a place where worms could live. Then, we helped wake up the biological activity that attracts them. Now comes the final piece: food. One of the most common mistakes gardeners make is assuming that once worms arrive, the job is done. For a while, everything looks promising. You start seeing more worms. The soil feels better, plants seem healthier, and then, a few months later, progress slows down. Why? Because worms don't stay where food is scarce. Just like any living creature, they go where resources are available. That's why some gardens seem to improve for a season, and then stall. The habitat is there, the activity is there, but the food supply never keeps up. That's where method 3 comes in. Feed the system. Many gardeners believe compost exists primarily to feed plants, but one of its most important jobs is feeding the life below ground: the worms, the microbes, and the countless organisms working beneath the surface every single day. Without that food source, the entire system gradually loses momentum. With it, the system becomes stronger over time. This doesn't have to be complicated. Compost, shredded leaves, grass clippings, aged manure, leaf mold, and other forms of organic matter can all help support the soil food web. The specific material matters less than the consistency. That's the key: consistency. Many gardeners try to rush the process by adding huge amounts all at once. Then they wonder why results don't match expectations. Healthy soil is rarely built through intensity. It's built through repetition. Small additions made regularly almost always outperform massive additions made occasionally. And if you look closely, that's exactly how nature works. Leaves fall. Organic matter accumulates. Worms and soil life consume it. Then the cycle repeats. Year after year. Season after season. That's the system we're trying to build. Not a temporary improvement. A self-sustaining process. And that's where many gardeners experience the biggest shift in perspective. For years, they focus on growing better plants. Then, eventually, they realize something that changes everything. The goal was never to grow better plants. The goal was to build soil that grows better plants for you. Once that idea clicks, gardening becomes much simpler. Instead of constantly fighting problems, you're supporting a process. Instead of searching for the next solution, you're strengthening a system. And strong systems tend to improve with time. Imagine walking into your garden 6 months from now. You pull back the mulch and see worms almost everywhere you look. The soil crumbles easily in your hands. Water soaks in instead of running off the surface. Plants recover faster after periods of heat and drought. And the garden feels healthier than it did just a season ago. Now imagine returning a year from now. The difference is even more obvious. The soil is darker, softer, richer. Harvests are larger. Plants are stronger. And you're spending far less time trying to solve the same problems that once frustrated you every year. Your neighbors won't notice the cardboard. They won't know anything about fermented rice water, and they'll never see the worms working beneath the surface. What they'll notice are healthier plants, stronger harvests, and a garden that seems to get better with every passing season. Not because of a miracle product, not because of a secret shortcut, but because you followed the same process healthy soil has relied on all along. First, create a place where worms want to live. Then, wake up the activity that attracts them. And finally, provide enough food to keep them there. That's the 3-step worm magnet system. And when all 3 steps work together, something remarkable happens. The worms stay, the soil improves, and the garden begins doing more of the work for you. Most gardeners spend years trying to grow healthier plants. The smartest gardeners focus on growing healthier soil, because when worms stay, healthy soil follows. And when healthy soil follows, everything above ground gets easier.